Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 1 cheat sheet. If you've never watched the cheat sheet series before, it's effectively a series where we rank all the players in FPL by position and price and look at effectively their efficiency, considering these sort of small to medium term run of games. So you'll see Game Weeks 1 to 3 on the video, but I'll be considering even beyond that, of course, but with a little bit less importance, a place towards future game weeks. And then we'll also look at historical stats, underlying stats, and any sort of topical changes based on the season and sort of my understanding in terms of, let's say, the importance of a player within a tactical structure, that sort of thing. This video has also been supported by Fantasy Football Hub. A lot of the data projections that they create, also the historical stats supplied by Opta, have been used in conjunction with the sort of analysis for this video series. So if you want some of that sort of premium data, they do have a competitive offer, which is 50% off for the start of the season, and also a deal which is to win your mini league or to get your money back as well for this season. So do have a look at Fantasy Football Hub. Very interesting website that can definitely help you find some new picks as well and consider, how to maybe balance out your team at times, that sort of thing. So starting with the cheat sheet here at the 5.0 position, I think that initially we had the expectation that Rodgers would be the only interesting player in this position to start the season, but I have to say that Bob and Amad Diallo are very interesting to me, and Bob meaning Oscar Bob. So what I like about Oscar Bob is I think his position in the City team is quite fragile, in the sense that as soon as some of these European players come back or some of the Copa America players come back, that he could lose his position in the team as a starter. But he has looked brilliant in the preseason, and I do think that this is a big season where he can step up in the team. And he could even play maybe, let's say, multiple roles, because we've seen him play left wing before. That's where he scored the great goal last season from the Kevin De Bruyne assist, if you guys remember. But in the preseason, he's been firmly playing the right wing role. I also tend to think that Pep seems to speak very highly of him, and he could maybe be utilized in different spaces. So as an early season punt, when you spend an additional 0.5 million on a player, most often than not, a 4.5 midfielder or 4.5 million forward is someone that we're comfortable benching every single week. If you spend an additional 0.5, I don't necessarily see it that bad, particularly if you, let's say, are angling for an early wildcard as well, to consider someone like Bob or Amad Diallo within your teams. What I like about Amad, for example, is how good of a fixture that is versus Fulham at home. If you kind of see him as a pick where maybe he could really help out with some bench boost ones, or if you, once again, plan on benching a player, don't really care about it, but you want that sort of early punt, to maybe, let's say, cover a tough fixture from another player within your team, like maybe Nkunku is a good example of that, then you can definitely consider Amad within your draft. And what I like about Bob is that there's a lot of risk associated with it, but it can go extremely well for you, because if you can land someone who might start the season quite hot with City, have a good run of games like Alvarez last season, who isn't really going to play many minutes for City anyways because of his own inclusion on sort of national team fixtures, Bob could be a very interesting pick to start. At 5.5 million, we have Andreas Pereira, and I would say it's a little bit tricky sort of considering him, because some people have differing importance levels of, how he fits within this Fulham team. I think he should start most of the games going forwards. I have seen some transfer news, but nothing conclusive, and I do think that he is set to stay at Fulham. He should also have a lot of the set pieces in place, which means that is something that's going to stay good regardless of, let's say, Smith Rowe joining the team. So one thing that we like about Pereira is the potential to get penalties, to have set pieces still bestowed towards him. And if Willian doesn't re-sign with the team, which seems to be how things are leading, with Willian at least, then Pereira becomes a better pick for me. And it would be nice if we got a little bit more data over the preseason, but we only have a few fixtures left to sort of see Pereira maybe take a penalty in a preseason fixture for Fulham for us to even decide that. As far as the rest of the field, I think there are so many competitive picks this time around. And one of the picks that I think I might even be missing is Dwight McNeil, but I do think that Everton are definitely worth considering a little bit later down the line. But I've had a huge selection of players, and it was really tough to sort of split them into different categories. So Elliott I like a lot, but I have put an asterisk around him too, because unfortunately his position in the team might be fragile, right? If McAllister joins the team again, you're looking at effectively 3 positions split between 4 players, maybe 4.5 if you consider Gravenberch and even Endo, who I think might be on the peripheries of getting into the team going forwards. But yeah, it's Jones, it's Sobo, it's Elliott who can get the minutes, mostly speaking. And the big question mark is who's going to get the minutes at the 10 spot. And Right now, I still think that it can actually be split between Elliott and Sobbo and even McAllister, because we've seen the manager talk about it already thus far, and it's very clear that he sees Elliott as a 10. We've even seen him as a 9 in the preseason, but then Sobbo can clearly play there, and I haven't really seen him talk about McAllister because he hasn't talked about some of the players who are yet to come back into the team who have rejoined, right? Darwin is a good example. Virgil's back now. Trent will be back for the next preseason fixture, and we can get a little bit more insight on someone like Elliott very soon. As far as Smith Rowe, my only concern is the start of the season minutes. He hasn't played too much competitive football in a while. He has been active within some of the Arsenal preseason fixture games, but until he really gets minutes under his legs, I'm probably not going to shoot him up too far up, even though Fulham have really good fixtures. Semenyo is a player that I quite like because it seems like Solanke might be nursing an issue. He might also be leaving the team soon. So you never know, you might get Semenyo playing minutes as a striker, but I do think his minutes close to the end of last season were very strong. Not too much competition in that right wing position. I still think he's a good pick. Is he that interesting to start the season off with? Maybe no. I did start my first draft with him, but I'm a little bit cooler now on Semenyo, given that we have so much more value in other positions that seem to be very clear. Hudson-Odoi, I mean, you can definitely put him in the same bracket as Elanga, but I think one of the concerns now is that Nottingham Forest actually have quite a lot of depth. And even though I think Hudson-Odoi may be a little bit more important to the team as of now, my concern still going forwards with Nottingham Forest players is, are they that good of an attack? And is the attack even that geared towards some of the wingers, right? Because when you look at last season, they were still quite comfortably a bottom 4-5 offense, but actually a lot of the XG was shared by Chris Wood and him alone. So when you look at Hudson-Odoi, he does pale in comparison to a lot of the other 5.5 midfielder picks. And even though the run of games is good, you'd have to make sure that the minutes are very good too, which could be a bit shaky considering the rotation in place. And that same argument generally applies to Chris Wood, but I think that start of the season, considering that Taiwo has a lot of fitness to build, he should be quite safe. Mavididi is someone who I think actually doesn't have a great run of games to start the season, but once Leicester do have a better run of games, I think he's a very interesting pick. We know that they haven't been able to sign players in the 10 position that they really want. And he can play multiple roles in the team, and he takes set pieces and can even take penalties, maybe if Jamie Vardy is off the field. So that is what I like about Mavididi a lot, but he's really one to consider later into the season. And once again, he's a bit more of an enabler type than Andreas Pereira. So quite high floor, maybe a little bit lower ceiling, just given, you know, the sorts of players or teams, you know, respective to Leicester at least. And that's it. With some of the other players here, you have a little bit more upside, I suppose, in terms of the quality of fixtures to start within, let's say, Murphy and Kamada. But one of my issues with Kamada and Murphy is just going to be minutes, right? I think I see both of these players, even if they are consistent starters, as early substitutions, because when you look at Kamada, you know, when he was playing under Glasner, his minutes were still pretty poor. When you look at someone like Murphy, his minutes have definitely been poor, and his minutes will definitely also be managed. So I can't necessarily see them being as fruitful as maybe some of their underlying stats have been in seasons past. And that's sort of my main concern. I'd rather spend the money on someone who I think could actually start the full game and complete it, like maybe even a Bob, going back to the Man City point, than someone like Murphy, for example. And then when it comes to, let's say, Elanga, as I said, I do think that he could very well be sort of put up another tier, because the underlying stats are actually really good for Elanga, but I do think they have quite a bit of depth. And in terms of sort of the pecking order of side of things, I do think Hudson-Odoi maybe is a little bit ahead of him in terms of importance, right? So we saw a lot of Elanga substitutions at the end of last season. I think we could still see some of them early this season and even benchings. And so that's kind of concerning. At the 6.5 million position, I think we just have a lot of value here. I haven't really changed my mind on too many of these players, because so far with Spurs, you can see that there isn't really anyone contesting the minutes of Brennan Johnson. So he just is electric because the underlying data is just amazing. With Bailey, we still think that he'll probably be on set pieces. Who knows? He might take penalties. I don't think so, but underlying stats are really, really good, and his minutes also look really safe. Diaby has also left the team since we last filmed the video. Gibbs White, a little bit of the sort of higher floor, lower ceiling kind of archetype, very much like Andreas. Do I really want to start the season with Gibbs White? Not necessarily. I think Nkunku is still the ace in the field. Great numbers, you know, historically speaking, even going back to the Bundesliga, but really, really good preseason minutes so far. Basically playing 90 minutes a game, getting full fitness back in his legs, and looks like a key piece and cog to this Enzo Maresca team, and can play clearly multiple positions, as we have already seen within the preseason, right? So we can't even see him maybe play left wing at time to time. So I think he's pretty much impervious to sort of benchings, I would probably say, to start off with, unless things go really poor. But he looks like a quality player, and I think he can have a great season too. So why you wouldn't start with Nkunku is probably just to maybe swerve against the ownership, but I still think there's not much to sort of not love. Kulusevski is an interesting one. He has an asterisk here because he's been playing as the 9 for Spurs within the preseason. That immediately makes him interesting, but we do know that he's a little bit of a sort of deeper playmaker. He could just drop and sort of be a false 9 as opposed to sort of like an out-and-out 9, and that's a big difference. He's not on penalties. His underlying data historically has been also pretty poor, so I don't love Kulusevski that much. I think he's a bit of a risk just because I don't particularly rate him and his sort of ability to convert things into FPL points. But Brennan Johnson I'd have a little bit more confidence in, even if you can argue that the finishing is poor from that. Because when you look at, for example, the XG last season, it's very, very far apart, and same with the XA. So it's very clear that Brennan Johnson is a huge open play threat. Maybe you can argue the finishing will remain poor, but I'd still trust, I would say, intuitively the data than Kulusevski, who's not, let's say, a lethal finisher or anything of the sort. So not some sort of skilled overperformer that I'm too worried about. Garnacho, I think it's a case of how you rate United at the start of the season, because of course, if you see him coming back into the team immediately, the one asterisk is, you know, he's coming back from the Copa America and hasn't had many minutes in his legs in the preseason. So starting the season with Garnacho, I think, is a little bit risky in terms of how the minutes are going to be split within players like Rashford and Garnacho. I still see them as the sort of starting wingers for the team, but there is now quite a bit of depth amongst a lot of positions, right? You have Sancho, you have Bruno coming back, you have Anthony, you have Xerxes in the team. So these are a lot of attackers now. And in the wing position specifically, we're just talking Anthony, maybe Sancho, and clearly Ahmad, who's had a great preseason so far. So does Garnacho get the same amount of minutes that he did enjoy close towards the second half of the season? I'm not so sure of that. So I think there is definitely an asterisk there, and we'll see maybe early in the season whether Ahmad will lose his spot too early to, let's say, someone like Garnacho and Rashford. With Sobo, I've got to say that I'm a little bit cooler on Sobel than most, and I can understand why people are high on him. But once again, you know, hasn't had too many set pieces traditionally sort of given to him by Trent or Robertson when they're on the field. So you lose that aspect. The minutes could definitely be contested in the 10 spot with Harvey Elliott, who I think just has been brilliant in the preseason. He was also fatigued enough to have missed the Man United fixture. So that's also another point of concern, given that we saw a pretty tired Sobo within the fixtures for Hungary within the European Championships. So it's not exactly a great look for him to start the season. But if we find out that he's consistently starting over Elliott in the 10, will I move to him later down the season? Absolutely. But do you need to start the season with him? I'm not quite sure about that. As far as Grealish, I still have to say that at 6.5, I think he's very interesting if you think that he's absolutely nailed to start. But do I really want to start the season with Grealish, if I'm being completely honest, despite the numbers being pretty decent, considering he's a City attacker as well? I would still say no. So I'm a little bit low on Grealish, and I think I can apply the same argument to some of the other players here within this list, unfortunately, because when I look at someone like, let's say, Kudus, unfortunately, you know, West Ham actually look like they've made some of the best signings within the summer. But the question is going to be the opposite, I suppose, where the fixtures aren't amazing. So am I that keen on starting the season with Kudus? Not necessarily. I'd probably wait for a better window to move into these players. Like if I really thought Grealish was finally perma-nailed, I'd probably consider him. With Barnes, he actually has incredible open play numbers. But then the question is that unless Gordon actually leaves to Liverpool, which is a rumor, but I don't think it's substantiated because it doesn't seem like the sort of transfer news has really moved too much in that front. But Barnes consistently starting at left wing would be interesting. But with Murphy doing well, and I think Gordon probably still preferably playing on the left, I can't see Barnes being that interesting a pick to start the season off with. But if there's a key transfer, or we suddenly start to see something like Gordon right wing and Barnes left wing predominantly, then of course Barnes becomes someone who has to move up the pecking order. In the 7.0 territory, I just love Eze. I don't think there's much to discuss here, but with Mbumo, the question mark is going to be on Tony once again. The starting fixtures are really good for Mbumo. So if you want to start the season with him and you're angling for wildcard 4, maybe you're angling for wildcard 2, I can kind of see the logic there. Would I class him as a green pick until Tony leaves the club? Probably not, because we're still waiting for him to get penalties back. And I think that's a huge sort of amplifier to the team, plus sort of the role, which has been actually benefited from Igor Thiago being injured. It might mean, you know, more minutes for Mbumo in more advanced positions. And that's something that you always love in FPL. With Martinelli, Trossard, and Rashford, I still think that I'm quite high on Rashford, to be honest, just like I'm high on Garnacho. But if you clearly see the way that I've sort of profiled all these players in their categories, it's very clear that I have all the United players high up, but Ahmad maybe more so as a little bit of an early punt, and then I can see Garnacho and Rashford taking the spots back within the team. I think if anyone was more susceptible to losing minutes immediately at the start of the season, I would have to say it's probably Garnacho as opposed to, let's say, Rashford when it comes to losing minutes to, let's say, Diallo, because of course someone has to play left wing, it's probably Rashford. Someone has to play right wing, it's probably Ahmad. And so because of that, I think Garnacho could lose out or Ahmad will lose out, and we'll find out very soon. But Rashford is someone that I actually wouldn't mind starting the season off with if you can sort of bake in the historical sort of underlyings as well from a season past, right? 23 was an amazing season for Rashford, and he's always been a very consistent sort of high XG accumulating midfielder. So I think he's still quite interesting, particularly since United fortunately have a good fixture in game week 1, and that's always the most important fixture to start off with any sort of fantasy tinkering. With Martinelli and Trossard, I still think the minutes are very up in the air. I still see early substitutions for these sorts of players, and do I really love having players that can, you know, at one point in time become the benched player? Not really, right? So even though Martinelli has had a decent preseason so far, I can't see Trossard just losing out entirely in terms of minutes, and he could very well just take his starting spot back just like he did at the end of last season. At 7.5, still very high on Gordon, no comments there. Jota is definitely on my mind. It's nice that he's actually rejoined the team a little bit earlier than Darwin, but we will get one friendly to sort of see how Jota and Darwin interrelate in the system. We also have Gakpo back, I believe, with full Liverpool training now. So we'll find out more what happens to the minutes of players like Carvalho, who's taken the left wing minutes at the start. And then also what happens really with the center forward position, right? Whether Gakpo will play center forward, whether he plays left wing, which means immediately I would say he's a little bit less interesting to me, but we know that some of the attackers, even in the wing positions for Liverpool and also slot, particularly when you go back to the Feyenoord season, with Minte, can be very, very good. So I quite like that still. Bowen, I think, is actually really well priced. I'm just waiting for a good West Ham fixture swing. Maddison, Luis Diaz, a little bit cooler on, because I do think Maddison, his minutes, we definitely saw a drop off at the end of last season. I think that they can still be a little bit dicey, particularly if, let's say, they sign another forward and maybe you have Kulusevski sort of stealing minutes away from him. Plus also he was a sub naturally anyways, and it wasn't always just 1-for-1 for Kulusevski. Luis Diaz, I also think, you know, he could suffer too when it comes to minutes this season, very much so. And it's very clear that his underlying numbers compared to some of the other Liverpool players weren't exactly at the same level. So a little bit lower on him, particularly when we're thinking that Jota can be the center forward, whereas Luis Diaz is just going to be the left winger. At 8.5, no changes there. The only change to the City players has been, unfortunately, some of the City players have been downgraded in terms of their estimations for game week 1. I am very high on Foden and KDB still, but the question is just going to be about whether they're actually going to even make it to game week 1. Pep's comments so far, we know that he can lie, but I think we'll find out based on the Community Shield when exactly we'll see players like Foden, KDB, Bernardo Silva, Walker, etc. So tentatively, I've dropped Foden for now, but I really wouldn't mind U-turning my decision on this once we find out after the Community Shield. And then Saka, Son, Palmer, Salah, I just think are brilliant. Nothing really wrong with them as players. The minutes should be there. Saka's already going to join up with the team soon. Son has already had a great preseason, and then Palmer should be a key player for Chelsea. I don't see anything changing there despite the change in manager, and then Salah is Salah. In the forward position, there hasn't been too many changes from sort of my best forwards video. So I've added Vardy, but he's really not that interesting to me. I think his minutes can still be a little bit dicey, and the Leicester fixtures aren't amazing. With João Pedro, we know he's back training with Brighton, but he hasn't played a single preseason minute so far for the team. So that calls into question his fitness, and therefore that's why the asterisk is there. I still think I'm high on Armstrong when I look at the sort of season-long betting market data. The goal projections are actually quite high for him. It's around 9, so it suggests that he's still a very good budget forward to operate with. At 6 million as well, you're looking at Wood and Muniz. Nothing has changed. Calvert-Lewin, not the greatest of fixtures. Really, really good for XG per 90, but am I that keen on him? Still, no. Cunha, tough fixtures. And then with Arsenal players, with Jesus, I've added him back in there because the preseason, I think, has been a huge boost for Jesus and his expectations in minutes, which also means that correspondingly, we have to react accordingly to Havertz, right? He scored actually from the left 8 position in the previous match, but you have to say that there is naturally an impact when Havertz plays center forward versus left 8. And I believe I spoke about some of the numbers, but there's a huge gulf in expected goals per 90 for Havertz, and you want more shots on target for a forward. You want more shots in general. You want expected goal share. And that's not going to happen if he plays in the left 8. And I think there could be definitely a bit more minute split than we previously thought. So I have to drop Havertz and also add Jesus to the sheet. Richarlison, still someone I would definitely swerve for now. Solanke, there's a bit of question marks over him. With Mateta, I'm actually a little bit higher on him than most because he actually has had a holiday break before the Olympics, and it's not like he was part of the French European squad. So it's going to be the case where I think he's match fit. he'll come back into the team and he'll probably slot right back in. Does he start for game week 1? I'm not so sure necessarily, but I think he very well could, because despite France actually still progressing within the Olympic, the question I suppose is whether he's going to take another sort of holiday break or whether he's just going to come back into the team. And I think it's actually more likely that he'll come back into the team, given that he got a holiday break before the Olympic training session started with Thierry Henry. So I quite like Mateta. With Gakpo, Darwin, I still think that I need to see more before I'm really too high on these players particularly, but we know that this Liverpool team have a great run of games to start. We know that this Liverpool team are probably going to remain a very, very strong offensive team, at least at the start. And nothing in the preseason has really probably changed our mind on these sorts of things. So I'm still quite interested in these sorts of players and very firmly comfortable that they're going to be good picks. But are they green picks necessary right now? Probably not. Tony, same issue with him despite the Thiago injury, because who knows? He could still be sold, I suppose, before the end of the transfer window, which would either mean the transfer actually works out really well for you if you own Tony in the team, but I still think he'll start the season with Brentford. And look, undoubtedly the fixtures are actually quite good for him. And then beyond that, a lot of the forwards, I don't think I have sort of any sort of opinions to change on certain players. Isak, Watkins, and Haaland, I just think are incredible to start the season. Watkins, yes, you have to say that game week 2 is not great. So I can see a lot of people eyeing up the idea of transferring into Watkins in game week 3 or 4. I'd probably do it specifically on game week 4. Because I think Tottenham at home for Isak is just a great fixture. I really wouldn't really be too concerned about it. But that's my sort of sentiments right now on Watkins. I can see people starting the season with him, seeing him as a little bit of a perma starter, and I think that's fine. But you can also wait and see potentially with him, or just realize that the rest of your team is very strong. Like, I don't think there's particularly a bad idea being sort of executed by any manager who chooses to go Isak over Watkins for the first 5 game weeks, for example. I think that's totally fine. And those are my thoughts in terms of the forwards. As far as the defense, not too many changes here. I have made some changes on the 4.0 position. We saw that Barco was rested as a precaution for the previous match, but I think he should still start the season very comfortably. He's probably played a lot of minutes, doesn't necessarily need to play too much more. Harwood Bellis just has a better run of games than the rest, which is why I've now downgraded Faze and Johnson. Barco I like a lot as a starting option because, you know, with Gross leaving, that's more set pieces too. But it's also a case where with Estupiñán nowhere near the training picture right now, even if he comes back around game weeks 4 and 5, I can still see Barco starting ahead of him because someone like Estupiñán, who has missed an entire preseason, needs to build his match fitness, and it's not going to be through starting a fixture immediately as soon as he comes back. It's going to be slow. It's going to be gradual. He could play, you know, closed door friendlies, and then he can play maybe 10-20 minutes off the bench, and then he starts fixtures. So I think that gives Barco ample time to maybe be a good upside option. At 4.5, I've added Colwill, Murillo to the list. That was probably the mistake back then. Burn, I've dropped a little bit. Hall, I've actually moved up in my estimations. I think that we've seen Newcastle trialing with a back 3. That's very interesting. Makes Hall even more exciting for me, even though we've already seen him in a back 4. It makes Livramento exciting too, but Trippier at this moment in time is still at the club. So that's a huge reason why I'd probably go Hall over Livramento for now. And I would say when you're looking at some of the other players, it's all about the quality of the fixtures at the start for players like Konsa, definitely. Because Aston Villa, we don't tend to look at as a very strong defense, but the fixtures, I have to say, are really good up until, let's say, game week 6, right? It's just a good run of games. They cover Arsenal fixtures nicely in game weeks 4 and 5. With Brighton, there's the same logic there in 4 and 5, and then they look like options that you can keep for a long term. Anderson, options like Murillo as well, really good defenses, generally speaking. The reason why I'm a little bit lower in Nottingham Forest is because when I look at some of the market sort of projections, some of the team model projections that we've seen, they still seem to be a little bit lower on Nottingham Forest. So I've sort of taken the word of a third party here in this case, but I think there's nothing really wrong with going with the Nottingham Forest goalkeeper or even a defender to start. It's just me sort of referencing multiple sources, looking at, for example, where I'd like to play key players on certain windows. And I think you also have to think that some of the 4.5 players are simply rotation options. So would I prefer, let's say, someone like Anderson? Probably. And then Colwell, I do think he should be nailed to start the season with Chelsea. I've seen that his preseason minutes have been lovely under Enzo Maresca. Can't see that changing. Martinez will probably come back to the team soon, so that's nice. But once again, are you comfortable, I suppose, going headfirst into United defense? I'd say probably not. So I'm a little bit lower on someone like Lisandro Martinez now. The same applies to someone like Fulham, who I think also, once again, slightly poor defense, but you have someone like Robinson who actually is quite comfortably a very solid attacker. So I do really like him as a pick, and I think he's very strong. The Sessegnon transfer doesn't really change my mind too much on him. And then Rico Lewis is the interesting pick, right? Because I think when you talk about someone like Rico Lewis, one thing I have to say is that, look, You're looking at a player who can play maybe in the midfield, as Pep has talked about. But I still can see that he could maybe play some gap filling minutes in the right back position. He has himself spoken about, I guess, his reluctance to play within the fullback position and his want to sort of assert himself into the team as a midfielder. But I do think his minutes can be dicey very, very quickly. So to me, he's a little bit of a double-edged coin where it can go really well and he can continue to start for, say, or it can go really poorly and suddenly you have to probably not waste the transfer on him, but, you know, use him or see him as a bit of a dud because he's not going to be starting fixtures maybe beyond game week 3 when, let's say, Walker's back fit and takes those right back minutes back, and Kovacic, for example, and Bernardo are midfielders who can take away his minutes as well. As far as, let's say, Kwanzaa, I still think that there's a bit of a risk with starts versus Konate, but if we get any indication that Kwanzaa is high up in the pecking order, that Konate wouldn't be a big part of the team to start the season, I mean, I'd be all over Kwanzaa immediately. But right now, just exercising a little bit of caution because I think that the starts can be a bit varied between Kwanzaa and Konate to start. Maybe we can change our mind on that quickly and we can adjust. Van de Ven, I don't love Spurs to go for a center back necessarily. I think I'm more of a fullback or bust sort of a thinker in terms of Spurs. We saw Romero and Van de Ven were great for set piece sort of attacking, but yeah, still a little bit low on the defense as a whole. With Udogie, I've dropped him from the sort of previous video because I still haven't necessarily seen news that he's exactly, you know, fit and ready to play. So maybe we've heard news that even and seen that Jed Spence can even play the left back position. So that's nice. Munoz still comfortably is my number one sort of 5.0 option. Shaw and Dalot, interesting options, but nothing too exciting for now, given that they're United defenders. 5.5 at Porro, I think he's definitely the sort of steal in this price point. Good fixtures to start the season, amazing underlying stats, had a great preseason so far as well, not much to not like. In the 6.0 position, there hasn't really been too many changes in terms of, you know, how I've sort of rated some of these players. I still think Gabriel's minutes will be great to start the season, but I'm a little bit concerned about whether he will even actually continue to start, you know, beyond a certain fixture. Because yes, I think Calafiori has been signed and he can play left back, but very clearly he's also there to sort of make a statement and probably can contest someone like Gabriel for minutes. Does that make me low on Gabriel at the start of the season? A little bit, honestly. I'd probably still go with Saliba. And for that reason, I've dropped Gabriel as well because the starting fixtures just aren't that great for Arsenal beyond, let's say, game weeks 1 and 3. Robertson, Tsimikas actually scored in the preseason game last, but the key thing is he's also struggled in the preseason. He's had an injury that he's dealing with, and that's why he's not in the US camp. I'd probably look at Robertson as someone who can definitely shoot up these rankings as soon as possible. But until that happens, I'm not really keen on someone like Robertson for the early doors because I still think that Tsimikas is more than capable of starting the season as the left back for Liverpool, particularly if Robertson isn't ready and fully fit to start games. And with White and Alexander-Arnold, I have to say it's all about fixtures. That's why we have White a little bit lower than you'd probably expect. And then Trent Alexander-Arnold as that dominant option. As far as the goalkeeper side of things, this is the first time you're seeing the goalkeeper cheat sheet. I have Henderson number 1, Flecken right behind, Sells there as well. Those are my top 3 4.5 goalkeepers, simply because I think that I'm not too keen on the Chelsea team, I suppose, from a defensive point of view at the start of the season. Just given the managerial change, given the amount of pieces, I suppose, that have joined the team, how much we're expecting things to shake up with players like Sanchez and Jorgensen maybe losing positions, etc. Maybe players even sort of deciding who's going to play right back, sort of right center back, right back, left back as well within the team. Doesn't give me that much confidence. I think Sells seems like the starting goalkeeper, although there's still an asterisk on him. Henderson, we've seen him start back-to-back friendlies now after coming back from the sort of Euro sabbatical, and so he seems like he's very clearly going to start the season as the Crystal Palace number 1. I like his fixtures a lot. Flecken, we know, makes a lot of saves for Brentford. They concede a lot of shots, but not necessarily a lot of high-quality shots, just a lot of shots in general. So that is really helpful in terms of the save metric. You know, you can always fall back on that with someone like Flecken. Martinez was the greatest shot stopper in the Premier League last season. Will that repeat itself? I don't think that always tends to do so, but great opening fixtures for Aston Villa. Nothing much to really not like, or dislike rather, at the start. Onana, Pickford, Vicario, Pope, very different keepers, right? You have someone like Onana, Vicario playing for weaker defenses, but could make a lot of great saves. Pickford and Pope probably paying for what I would say are stronger defenses, probably making less saves, entirely reliant on the clean sheets to get points. And because the fixtures aren't amazing for, let's say, Pickford, I just don't love it. Newcastle, we did sort of peg them a little bit down after last season, unfortunately. So that's why I'm a little bit lower on Pope to start, even though the fixtures are good for Newcastle. And then with Fulham, I think they've got great fixtures to start, so there's nothing really wrong with going with Leno at the start. But then the question, I suppose, is always going to be, do you really need to spend that sort of money on Leno, particularly if we think that, let's say, Fulham defense is going to struggle a little bit this season? As far as the 5.5 goalkeepers, I think if you're wildcard agnostic, I still like Raya the most. I think Arsenal are the best defense in the league. Ederson works a lot still because it doesn't seem like he's going to join a Saudi club. A lot of the Saudi clubs have signed goalkeepers respectively, but actually Alisson, if you're considering maybe a bit of an earlier wild card, maybe he actually has the best run of games to start with. So something to think about. What I love, honestly, any of these goalkeepers, to be honest, to start with, I'd probably still go, based on my preference, to go for a cheaper goalkeeper. But I can understand people wanting to spend more money on goalkeepers, and part of that might come down to things like whether you're in a Salah only draft or a Haaland only draft, whether you're in a Nomium draft, things like that. So that always changes people's minds on their goalkeeper. And yes, I think goalkeepers are really good in terms of their projected point metrics, per price or per million. But it also depends on ultimately what you think can happen, because we've seen time and time again, if you look at historically some of the points that we've seen from goalkeepers, it's not really necessarily true that the 5.5 goalkeepers or the 5.0 goalkeepers are the ones who always give the most amount of points. There's always one goalkeeper or two that we really can't predict that ends up being the steal of the season, and that's why we have the goalkeepers list as it is. So that's the cheat sheet for now. For as things stand, I'm recording the video at around the 4th of August, and things will undoubtedly change, so there will be a final version of the cheat sheet. This is the preseason cheat sheet. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. I'll see you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.